Hello, I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Executive Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to today's program on Thin Ice, Polar Bears in a Changing Landscape with Dr. Erin Curry. The Lloyd Library was founded more than 140 years ago by three brothers who manufactured nature-based medicine. To support their research, they collected books and specimens about nature and had a strong commitment to conservation. Today, we continue to make conservation a priority. We consider it an imperative to talk about what is happening with sea ice, and fitting that Dr. Curry is presenting her lecture on Arctic Sea Ice Day. Erin Curry is the director of the Polar Bear Signature Project at the Lindner Center for Conservation and Research of Endangered Wildlife at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden. Originally from Philadelphia, Dr. Curry earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Animal Science from the University of Delaware. She went on to graduate school at Clemson University, where she earned her master's and Ph.D. in animal and veterinary sciences, focusing on beef, cattle, and pigs. We are in for a fascinating program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erin Curry.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Patricia, and thank you all for coming here today. It's a little bit of a stretch to go from pigs and beef cattle to polar bears, but really a lot of their reproductive processes have some commonalities. Today I'm here to talk about polar bears. I've worked at the Cincinnati Zoo for about 12 years, and my focus is on polar bear reproductive physiology. And by association, from studying polar bears so much, I've gotten to learn a lot about their environment and especially sea ice. So that's what we'll be talking about today. My talk is probably about 40 minutes long, and I left some time for questions at the end of it. So you can see my pointer. Oops, a little delay. Trying to go to the next slide. Maybe it just needs to wake up. Okay. Polar bears were listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 2008. And this was due to the threats of loss of sea ice. Polar bears rely on sea ice for everything, to carry out all of their life cycle needs, everything that they do. They need sea ice. Sorry, my clicker is not working. There we go. They need sea ice in order to hunt, to find the seals that they need to eat and to survive. They need sea ice to find their mates and to breed. And they also need sea ice to find dens, dig out dens, and raise their cubs and teach their cubs. They are considered an apex predator, so they are at the top of the food chain. And they're commonly referred to as the largest land carnivore, but by the end of this talk, I'll tell you why that is not totally accurate, largest land carnivore. Part of that reason is because polar bears, as their name implies, are actually marine bears, or Ursus maritimus, or bear of the sea bear. In some languages, they call them ice bear or ich bear. And that's because they don't actually rely on land. They rely on sea ice to carry out all of their needs. This is a picture of the North Pole. So we're looking straight down on the globe with the North Pole in the center. There are currently, it's estimated there are about 20 to 25,000 polar bears living in the Arctic, and these are spread across 19 subpopulations and 5 different countries. So just to orient you a little bit here, here's Alaska. So the US is one of the countries that has polar bears. Here we have Canada, Greenland. This is Svalbard, which is a territory of Norway, and then Russia. Polar bears, we know that they move in between subpopulations. So sometimes when we get population estimates of one population, maybe one population is increasing, another one is decreasing. We don't know for sure if those polar bears are actually thriving or dying, or if they're just transferring their numbers among populations. They're an extremely challenging species to study due to where they live in such a harsh environment. They do have some specialized adaptations for thermoregulation that allow them to survive and thrive in this environment. And the first, I have some pass-arounds here. The first is that they have hollow fur. So their fur actually has a hollow core, and this allows them to trap and absorb heat to keep them warm. And the second adaptation is that they have black skin. I don't know that you can see it too much on this one, a little bit, but the black skin also allows them to absorb heat and stay warm in this minus 40-degree environment that they live in. Has anyone ever heard of the Allen's rule or Allen's rule? Allen's rule is a biological rule that states that creatures living in the Arctic or frigid environments tend to have shorter and thicker appendages than those that live in tropical environments. So a great example of this is a polar bear versus a black bear. We can see their ears, which are appendages on them. If you think when we go outside in the wintertime, one of the first things that gets cold on us is our ears. That's why we wear hats and earmuffs. But you can see how tiny polar bear ears are compared to the ears of a black bear. Similarly, their tails, they also have short nubby tails compared to black bears and brown bears for the same reason, for just frostbite. It's just a way to protect themselves in these cold temperatures. Polar bears also have an amazing sense of smell. They can smell seals from 6 miles away, and that's a conservative estimate. Some people say it's more like 20 miles away. And they can smell seal breathing holes from about 1 mile away. So that's pretty incredible. Their sense of smell is estimated to be about 300 times better than that of a dog. And we tend to think of dogs as having one of the most amazing senses of smell of the creatures that we're familiar with. And that's 2,100 times better than the sense of smell of a human. When we document polar bear migration patterns and movement patterns by radio collar, we can see that they tend to walk perpendicular to crosswinds. So they're picking up new information with every step they take, new directional information that tells them where the next seal is, where the next male might be, where the next female and estrus. So they don't really live in a landscape, they live in a smellscape where their world is just totally influenced by the smells around them. Along with that, they also communicate by smell. So researchers in zoos actually have taken biopsies of the feet of polar bears. So polar bears, I have another one, have massive feet, massive snowshoe feet. This is a life-size polar bear print that we got at a polar bear procedure. So you can see how large their paws actually are. But with every step that they take, they're leaving physiological information for the other bears in the area. So it's a way for a male to find a female in estrus, or it's a way for a female with cubs to avoid a certain male that might predate on them. So they're always leaving chemical cues across the ice. And these ice footprints that we see, these are also used by researchers to find polar bears. So when most of the polar bear research in the Arctic is done by helicopters, so taking these helicopters up and flying them around, usually what they're looking for is the footprints of a polar bear, and then they can follow the footprints to find the actual bear, because the bears blend in so well to their icy backdrop that the footprints give a great clue as to their movement patterns. They are considered to be, they're probably best characterized as ambush predators. So what they do is they tend to hide at seal breathing holes, and they wait for the seals to come up for a breath, and they pounce onto that breathing hole and catch the seal and pull them up. Polar bears have very, very long necks compared to most species that we're familiar with, and those long necks allow them to get deep into those breathing holes. They can also hunt by stalking seals that are out hauled out on ice floes and catch them that way. So kind of a graphic picture, but it just shows how quickly this female has probably snuck up on this seal, caught him, and has food for her and her cub. It's estimated that female polar bears need to catch at least 1 seal every 5 to 6 days in order to maintain their body weight, and male polar bears need to catch at least 2 seals a week, maybe 3, depending on the size of the male, in order to not lose weight. Some ambitious polar bears or hungry polar bears will sometimes try to tackle walruses, but this is a tough one unless they can separate a walrus calf from the parents. Walruses, they're bigger than polar bears, number one. They also have super, super thick skin. And then obviously they have their own weapons to fend off a polar bear. So they don't have a lot of luck with walruses, although they coexist in the same environment. But polar bears are extremely smart, and there have been many cases of observers dating back to the 1800s of polar bears climbing up on rock cliffs above walrus colonies and throwing rocks or ice blocks with extreme accuracy, killing the walruses first shot and then going down and eating them. And this is not new. Researchers have been reporting it. I heard of one person talking about it last year, that he's witnessed polar bears do this. So it is a hunting technique. It seems to be learned after practice, so they don't do it naturally. But they occasionally have been observed doing this to eat walruses. They are also scavengers. So if a whale dies or remnants of a whale kill are left behind, polar bears will come together in groups, even though they're considered to be solitary species. Fun fact, a group of polar bears is known as a celebration of polar bears. So they come together and celebrate over these dead whales, which will last for weeks and feed an entire area of polar bears. And you can see all these guys look like they're in pretty good shape. You don't see a lot of ribs and bones sticking out here. But they do scavenge. They will eat kelp when there's no sea ice. Researchers think it just kind of keeps their digestive tract moving. There's not a lot of nutrient value in kelp. They'll also climb rocky cliffs to feast on both bird eggs and birds, but they're not well suited to do this. Polar bears, they are not goats that can easily climb up and down rock walls. This is pretty dangerous, and the amount of calories that they get from bird eggs is nowhere near what they would consume for a seal. So long term, this isn't a great method of survival, but polar bears that are really hungry have been observed to do this. So we talked about the first myth that polar bears are land carnivores. The second part I want to address is about polar bears being carnivorous. So researchers in the wild have been watching polar bears kill seals for years and years and years. And one thing they notice is that when seals are abundant, the polar bears will catch the seals, eat just the blubber, and leave the muscle behind, and then go on to the next hunt. So this got them wondering, why would a polar bear walk away from a protein-rich source in order to go hunt a new seal to find blubber when that's not a given? So they started doing studies in zoos, feeding polar bears known compositions of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And what they found is that polar bears will choose lower protein, so lower protein diet, low carb diet, but super high fat diet. So they've gotten some really cool video of these polar bears munching down on lard bars and leaving the meatballs behind. But this is making us now think of polar bears as being reclassified as not necessarily being carnivores, but being lipivores. So maybe we should be calling them the largest. They're not the largest sea lipivore, because that would probably be an orca, but we need to think of something better. But yeah, the new thing is that polar bears are now being reclassified as lipivores, which is really interesting and a great way that zoos have helped us better understand about the physiology of this species, because it's really impossible to do these types of studies in the wild. Polar bears need fat because they only have food available for 6 months of the year. So they only have access to food when seals are around, and that means they only have access to seals when there's ice present. But polar bears need to put on a lot of weight. Bears are a species where it's normal for them, it's healthy for them to become obese for certain parts of the year because their food won't be available at other parts of the year. And even though bears in zoos have pretty much unlimited access to food, they still exhibit the same seasonal patterns in weight gain and weight loss. This graph was from a female polar bear who lived at the Cincinnati Zoo, and every year, even though we didn't restrict her diet, she put on about 50 to 60% of her body weight every year and then lost it, cyclicity. In a cyclical cycle. When I looked at this and compared it to other females in the population, they seem to do the same thing. So female polar bears especially, they will go for 8-10 months without eating anything while they're raising their cubs. So it's really important that female polar bears put on a ton of weight in the springtime when seal pups are readily available in order to get them through the next winter when they have cubs by their side. So they estimate that to replace the nutrients of one seal, a polar bear would need to eat and catch 72 snow geese. They're not that fast, they're not great at catching birds. 1.5 caribou. A polar bear is not equipped to run long distances to chase down reindeer or anything like that. Catch 37 fish. They're not great fishers, they will fish, but that's not what they were built to do. 216 snow goose eggs, or 3 million crowberries. So it's a lot of work that would go into catching and eating most of those things. So really, polar bears need seals to survive. And seals need sea ice to survive. And what's so neat about sea ice is, although we tend to think of it as a platform for polar bears to hunt and to find mates and to dig dens, it's really what's underneath the sea ice that's important. So sea ice forms when salt water freezes and it pushes the salt out of the ice block. And when it pushes out the salt, it forms these small channels called brine channels. They're only about 1 millimeter wide, but nevertheless, these little, like a vein system that goes throughout the sea ice. Within these channels, algae can anchor themselves and start growing because the sea ice is close enough to the sun where photosynthesis can occur. So it's a great spot for algae to land and colonize and start growing. And then this algae creates an entirely new ecosystem beneath it. So small microscopic animal species will eat the sea algae, little fish will eat the zooplankton, big fish like Arctic cod eat the little fish, seals eat the big fish, and polar bears eat the seals. So it's a very probably oversimplified example of a food chain, but this is why we need sea ice in order to have seals, in order to have polar bears. I read a quote recently from Polar Bears International that said, sea ice is to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to the forest. So without sea ice, there is no ecosystem in the Arctic. But I thought this is a pretty neat picture. It really illustrates how the sea ice grows right beneath the ice. We don't see that side of the ice too often. But people need sea ice too. In addition to the animals that live up there, sea ice is a platform for transportation for indigenous people that need to hunt, increased access to hunting and to food sources out in the ocean. And probably most importantly, sea ice reflects heat and helps keep the ocean cool. We know that even a 1 or 2 or 3 degree shift in ocean temperature will kill off all the coral. It will kill off the small microorganisms that other species feed on. So it's important that the ocean stay at the temperature that it should be. I want to take you now from the Arctic sea ice. We're going to travel from the Arctic all the way to Cincinnati, Ohio for an abrupt transition here. So polar bears, yes, they live in the Arctic. They live in cold temperatures. Why are we studying them in zoos? Why are they so important that we have polar bears in zoos? Of course, people for educational and more for entertainment purposes like to visit zoos to see polar bears. They're inspiring, they're charismatic. But really the bottom line is wild bears are so difficult to study. They are up in an area that's dark for 6 months of the year. The weather patterns change frequently. All of the work needs to be done by helicopter, so it's super expensive to study wild bears, and just logistically really challenging. So scientists, field researchers included, are now turning to zoo bears to answer some of the questions that they've been unable to answer from wild bears. And a major benefit of working with zoo bears is that they can be monitored for their entire lives if need be. We can collect fecal samples from which we can get hormone information every single day for their entire lives if we wanted to. So we can do non-invasive sampling such as fecal collections, urine collections, behavioral investigations, dietary studies like the one I mentioned that showed that polar bears are lipivores. And also polar bears, they kind of have their annual veterinary exams, just like our cat or dogs do. Of course, polar bears are under anesthesia for safety reasons. But during these regularly scheduled exams, we can do minimally invasive studies. We can do ultrasounds on them. We can examine their reproductive tracts. We can see when polar bears might be ovulating. When we go in for polar bear procedures, it's really neat because we often have teams of people just sort of on standby. So first they'll call in like the anesthesia team, then they call in the cardiology team, then the dermatologist to look at the skin, then they'll have research requests. So it's this really neat sort of pattern of folks like moving in, getting the samples that they need and moving out. And you can imagine just how much data is collected at a single polar bear exam in a zoo. There's always people from the head of the bear to the butt of the bear and everywhere in between taking measurements and getting samples. In addition to sampling, zoos have an amazing audience. So zoos in North America have over 181 million annual visitors. That's more visitors than the NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLB attendance throughout the US combined. So think about the reach that zoos can have in their platform, their social media platforms, and how they can share messages of conservation, and education, and help the public better understand the plight of some of the species that we work with. Bears are also super smart. The walrus example was a good one of that, but smart animals are usually highly trainable. So we can train them to do complex behaviors in which we can collect even more information. This is a female polar bear out at the Oregon Zoo, and she was trained to wear an accelerometer. So similar to what we wear on our watches or Fitbits. It's directional, so it can tell, which direction she's moving, how many steps she's taking. But before this could be used out in wild bears, they first wanted to calibrate it using zoo bears, because you can watch the zoo bears and then see the patterns that they're doing. Are they eating? Are they sleeping? Are they walking? Are they swimming? And see what those patterns look like and compare them to the actual behaviors of the animal. So these studies have been used to calibrate collars that are now used to watch bears in the wild and learn about their movement patterns. We can also train bears to do things such as voluntarily walk on a treadmill. This bear is in a metabolic chamber where we can look at the energy that he's using to walk, say, a quarter of a mile. Then we can extrapolate to wild bears and find out how much energy they're using when they need to walk or swim among different ice flows to catch their next meal. So things like this, and with zoo bears, this training is totally voluntary. So these bears are trained to put their head into a little chute. They get a collar clipped around their neck. They can walk on the treadmill voluntarily, and our animals can always leave a training session whenever they want, but they always come back for the food. So you see this front little hole here, this bear is getting rewarded for walking on the treadmill. So he seems pretty happy to participate in this treadmill walk. I think maybe more people would walk on treadmills if we got little jelly beans every 5 minutes or so. But our polar bears at Cincinnati, they would work really hard for things like marshmallows, little marshmallows. They love the fats. Peanut butter was another favorite, but all bears, a lot of bears have different preferences. So you gotta find what works for your particular bear. Juice is one, watered down juice is a common one used, but they definitely seem to have a sweet tongue. An example of a study that we completed at Cincinnati Zoo in collaboration with many other zoos was working with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And we wanted to develop a completely non-invasive way of monitoring animals' heart rates. So things like heart rate, respiration rate, and body temperature are often used as proxies of animal health. So we know if a heart rate is elevated or respiration is elevated, that animal might be sick or it might be in distress. But how can you get those numbers without touching the animal? So field researchers are always interested in developing non-invasive ways, and zoos provide such a great place to do those types of studies. A lot of these studies were coming out during COVID and pre-COVID, where they were saying our fitness trackers can tell us like 2 days before we start getting symptoms because our heart rate might start increasing. And we think the same thing is probably applicable to animals as well. So our question was, can we utilize infrared thermography, essentially thermal imaging? We call it IRT for this study. Can we utilize infrared thermography to totally non-invasively figure out an animal's heart rate? So we're not touching the animal. We just want to see, can we see pulsations that might be indicative of a heart rate of 80 beats per minute or 60 beats per minute or 200 beats per minute? So we started off just with a little pilot study. This is a polar bear up in a zoo in Canada. And we just asked the keepers to put this infrared camera at the side of the training area while you feed him. We just want to see what kind of images we might be getting. So they did that for us, and they sent us the images. And when we broke it down, if we zoom in on the bear's temple, so here's his ear, here's his temple, his eye would be here and his nose would be out here. If we zoom in on the animal's temple and break it out frame by frame, we can see these subtle shifts in temperature. So you can see it's a little hotter there, cooler here, hotter there, cooler here, and so on and so on. And when we calculated what the beats per minute might be, assuming that that would be the animal's pulse, it came out to 78 beats per minute, which is what we thought a polar bear heart rate should be. But it wasn't truly validated because we didn't know for sure that the polar bear's heart rate was indeed 78 beats per minute. So what we needed to do was get our hands on an immobilized bear, a bear that was anesthetized for its annual physical exam, and actually hold a stethoscope to the bear's chest while we concurrently took these video images. So that was the next part of the project. And so this bear, just to orient you, she's laying on her back. You can see she has a tube, an intubation tube in her throat. We looked at two different areas, the heart rate, and we looked for heart rate and respiration rate. And when we amplified the signal slightly, we could see that this bear's heart rate under anesthesia was 49 beats per minute, which was exactly what the stethoscope told us that it was. So having that information, we can say for sure that this method was validated. These fluctuations in temperature are in fact indicative of the animal's actual heart rate. We did this in a few different bears, a few different places, just to get our numbers up and to prove it was truly validated. And then we took it a step further and we did it on 55 different species in zoos. So we did it at the Cincinnati Zoo, the Louisville Zoo, and Columbus Zoo, 55 different species, and it worked in 85% of the species that we tested. Overall, it was a project that didn't take more than a month to complete. So very little input on our part. The animals were anesthetized anyway, and we've developed technology that can now help wildlife researchers across many different species learn more about the animals that they're interested in. So the next step of this project is we want to couple this with a drone technology. Imagine you can fly over a colony of walruses or a herd of wildebeest or a celebration of polar bears and capture all of their heart rates and respiration rates, and also calculate their body mass over time and compare that year to year. So talk about non-invasive monitoring. That would be amazing if a drone's up in the air, polar bears can't even detect it, and you can gather all this information pretty inexpensively without touching the animal. Most of what I do at the zoo is focused on reproductive monitoring. So we know polar bears in the wild, they seem to be experiencing a decrease in reproductive rates. Females are skinnier, they're producing smaller litter sizes, and some females aren't producing cubs at all. But we don't know where exactly this process is failing. Are they not breeding? Are they losing the pregnancy somewhere along the way? So we're trying to answer those questions using zoo bears. So the techniques that we are trying to develop, we hope will enhance the evaluation of wild populations and ultimately help us to identify the point of reproductive failure. So then we can go back and figure out when exactly is this occurring and what is the exact cause. So this is just a list of some of the things that I've been working on over the last 12 years. We are characterizing reproductive processes in males, females, and juveniles, mostly through fecal hormone monitoring. So looking at seasonal changes in hormones in the breeding season versus the non-breeding season. We are trying to improve reproductive rates of our zoo bears. So developing assisted reproductive technologies such as artificial insemination and maybe helping bears ovulate that aren't ovulating on their own. We are preserving valuable genetic material by doing semen collections and cryopreservation of males in the population, all opportunistically when the males are out under anesthesia. Developing new monitoring methods. There currently is no way to determine whether or not a polar bear is pregnant, and I'll talk about that in another slide. So the development of a pregnancy test would be huge in helping us to better monitor bear populations in the wild. And also other biomarkers of reproductive health. So what is a fertile bear versus an infertile bear? Which bears are more likely to produce cubs at the end of the year versus those that fail to produce cubs? And of course, everything that we do in our zoo bears, we hope it will have some application to the in situ or the wild populations. So I'm going to talk about the pregnancy test stuff in a bit, but I want to give you some background on polar bear reproduction because this is a species that has a really interesting suite of reproductive phenomena. So first, they're seasonal breeders. As the daylight starts getting longer in January, February, their breeding season essentially starts. So males will start following females. We see it in both zoos in the wild. We usually see them breeding sometime in February, March, April, sometimes into May. And then if an embryo forms of a result of that breeding, so the sperm fertilizes the egg, the embryo grows to the blastocyst stage, which is only about 500 cells, then it stops growing. It enters a state of embryonic diapause or delayed implantation, which it stays in throughout the entire summer. So from February through October, the embryo is just sitting in the uterus, hanging out, doing nothing, not growing at all. Then as the photoperiod shortens in September, October, the bear receives some signal, we don't know what that signal is yet, for the embryo to resume growth and then implant into the uterus, and then a placenta forms. So that true pregnancy that we're used to, like with cats and dogs, lasts about 60 to 65 days. So that's when the fetus is actually growing, that's when the placenta is forming, that's when the bear, we call it true pregnancy versus the diapause phase of pregnancy. So true pregnancy lasts about 60 days, and pregnant bears will dig out dens, enter the dens, and they usually give birth in November and December. Bears are different than other North American bears. Polar bears are different than other North American bear species in that only pregnant females will den up in the wintertime to give birth. All the other bears, the males, the females with cubs, the non-pregnant females, and the juveniles that have left mom, they're all out hunting. They're all out catching seals. So just moms and babies will enter dens and give birth. So how do we monitor reproduction in a 600 to 800 pound large animal with teeth that we can't share space with? So we have to be pretty creative. We've tried training our bears for ultrasound examinations. This is really challenging in a species with a huge abdomen because our ultrasound probes don't penetrate deep enough. Polar bear uteruses are super small compared to a species of that size. So their uterine horns are only about the width of my pinky finger. They're about 10 inches long. But imagine trying to find that in the huge abdomen filled with intestines and other things. It's really, really difficult. Additionally, when polar bears, when they become pregnant at the end of the year in the true pregnancy, when we'd have a really good shot of finding a cub, they pack on all this weight. It's even harder to get through. And they sort of go into this like denning mode. So even though a bear that might have been trained perfectly for ultrasound exam from February through September, her hormones just switch, like a light switch, and then she goes off in a denning mode and she won't work for the marshmallows and she won't work for the peanut butter anymore. So even our best training efforts haven't resulted in us being able to diagnose pregnancy by ultrasound in this species. Morphological changes, people say, well, if she's so fat, she must be pregnant. But polar bear cubs, they are only about 1.5 pounds when they're born. Polar bears have the largest ratio of maternal to fetal weight, with the exception of the giant panda, of any placental species. So we don't see a baby bump in a 600-pound carnivore. Even if she has triplets, it doesn't make much of a dent in her abdomen. So we can't go by body weight because we know that they all have seasonal shifts in body weight. So we tend to rely on more physiological biomarkers. Things like blood would be awesome, but how hard is it to get a blood sample from an awake polar bear? We don't want to anesthetize a possibly pregnant female because we don't want to risk compromising that pregnancy. We've made some progress in blood. I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation, but for the longest time, blood was just a no-go. So we couldn't rely on blood. Urine is certainly useful for human pregnancy diagnosis. So like the pee on a stick test, that's based on a protein that the embryo excretes that the female then pees out, and you can do the pregnant versus not pregnant test. Bears don't have that protein, so it doesn't work in polar bears. I've tried it. And urine is also kind of timely for animal care staff to sit around and wait for. Bears spend some time swimming, they spend time often dripping wet, and urine samples that we usually get tend to be dilute, or just not entirely useful. And it's a lot of time on the keeper staff's time to sort of tell them to wait around and wait for a bear to pee, so you can go in there and siphon it up. But fecal samples are easy to collect. They're being picked up from the bear's habitats and exhibits every single day anyway. The keepers seem to be happy to put those fecal samples into a bag, label it with the animal's name and date, freeze it, and then send them to us a few times a year. So I've spent much of the last 12 years looking for things in a fecal sample that might be the pregnancy test, similar to the pee on a stick test, but the bear version of that. So since 2010, we've monitored over 60 bears in the North American population in different zoos. For some of these bears, we've monitored them for as long as 13 years. So we're really starting to generate these lifetimes worth of data on these zoo polar bears. Zoos are highly collaborative. So we've worked with 32 different institutions throughout North America. We've analyzed over 35,000 fecal samples for different hormones. And I brag that we have the largest polar bear fecal bank in the world right here in Cincinnati, Ohio. And in doing that, we've generated over 200 year-long profiles. So we know what females that are cycling look like. We know that what females that are pregnant or pseudo-pregnant look like. We know what a male that's in his like sexual maturity prime, we know what his testosterone profile should look like. So we've certainly learned a lot. And I want to show you some examples of what these fecal steroid metabolites profiles look like. So we tend to measure things in a fecal sample, molecules that are stable. So things like progesterone and cortisol and testosterone and estrogen, all these steroid hormones, they don't break down easily, which makes them really good candidates to monitor wildlife reproduction, because they can, if a bear poops on exhibit, that sample can sit there till the next morning, and then testosterone will still stay relatively intact so we can get an accurate measurement of it. So in female polar bears, we measure testosterone, which is the red line. It's sort of synonymous with estrogen for this example. And we measure progesterone, which is the blue line. And progesterone is the pregnancy hormone in all species with placentas, essentially. So in a lot of species, we can just use progesterone as a pregnancy test. We know it increases, and if it increases and stays elevated, we can usually say an individual is pregnant. That's not true in polar bears, though. So polar bears, we see this increase in testosterone around the time that breeding is observed. Then they go into that embryonic diapause phase where not much is happening on the ovary. They don't have a placenta yet, so their hormones are relatively quiet through the summer months. And then at the end of the summer and the early autumn, their progesterone shoots up around the time the embryo implants, and then it stays elevated for roughly 60 days until the female gives birth or not. So looking at this profile, it looks like, okay, yeah, we can see what a pregnancy looks like in a polar bear. That should be easy to diagnose. But then we started monitoring these pseudo-pregnant females, and their profiles are indistinguishable from those of pregnant females. So pseudo-pregnant females, they have this increase in testosterone whenever breeding is seen. They have low reproductive hormones all through the summer months. Their progesterone shoots up around the time the implantation should occur, and it drops off even though the bear doesn't give birth. So that was frustrating. And at first we thought, well, maybe these females are actually getting pregnant, but then they're losing the pregnancies, and that's what we're seeing. So then I started monitoring females that weren't housed with males. So females, 2 females, or a single female housed alone, their profiles look exactly the same. So we know that bears are capable of exhibiting these true pseudo-pregnancies. We can't distinguish pseudo-pregnancy from pregnancy loss, but probably some of these are pregnancy losses. But regardless, progesterone, which is sort of the gold standard for diagnosing pregnancy in many species, we've learned does not work in polar bears. So I could give probably a 2-hour talk called "Why Can't They Just Pee on a Stick?" and all the things I've tried. But we're just going to do a quick run through of some of the things I've looked at. So we've looked at fecal steroid metabolites, the progesterones, the testosterones. I've spent a lot of time and money investigating fecal proteins. So proteins are more fragile, less stable than the steroid hormones. So there hasn't been a lot of effort to put into that. And additionally, we don't know what we're looking for. What is the protein that is an indicator of polar bear pregnancy? So I've tried some methods where we looked at the entire fecal proteome and compared the fecal proteome of bears that gave birth to bears that didn't give birth. There were no differences. We've tried some more targeted analyses where we've had like a specific candidate protein in mind that we thought is produced only by the placenta. So we've done a lot of investigations just looking at those. Again, no differences between the two groups. We've tried to train an odor detection dog, a medical detection dog, to distinguish pregnancy from pseudo-pregnancy. And that was a fun project, but it didn't work in the end. But we have some, I took the slides out because it would have been too long, but we have some cute footage. Elvis's name is, he's still alive. But we trained Elvis on samples collected and stored at Cincinnati Zoo from known pregnant bears versus bears that we knew were not pregnant. And we had him smell out all these samples and learn what a pregnant sample looks like. But we learned that he couldn't generalize to new pregnancies. So we could give him a sample from a pregnancy on which he was trained, even if he never saw that sample, and he would get it right. But if we gave him a sample from a new pregnancy, he didn't pick up on it. So what we came to the conclusion is that he memorized these specific pregnancy signatures and didn't generalize. And when I spoke with some folks who do this medical detection dog stuff for a living, they said dogs are smart. We all know that. But you need at least 1,000 unique cases of a disease or condition in order for dogs to stop memorizing and start generalizing. So we will probably never get 1,000 polar bear pregnancies to train a dog on. So that one doesn't seem to be a feasible option. Because polar bears are so scent oriented, we looked at the volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, in the headspace above fecal samples. Again, there were no differences between the two groups. And we've started a collaboration with Cincinnati Children's looking at the metabolome of fecal samples collected from pregnant versus non-pregnant bears. And so far, there doesn't seem to be a specific signature associated with the pregnant state. So far, none of these have worked. And I think I'm almost out of ideas for things to look at in fecal samples. One of our, yeah. So I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. I have a lot of publications that describe negative data at this point. But I have not lost hope, because now with all the training that zoos are doing on a regular basis, we're now able to collect blood samples relatively frequently from bears across the entire population. And there's so many more hormones that we can measure in a blood sample compared to a fecal sample that really might hold the key to this polar bear pregnancy thing. Many of these hormones that are well characterized in humans and mice and cows, cats and dogs. We know what the ranges are. We know what normal is. We know what it should look like during pregnancy or disease state. We know nothing about most of these hormones in bears. So right now we have grants from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS grants, to study some of these hormones in bears and to characterize them. And hopefully they can provide some insight into pregnancy and fertility in polar bears. One quick example of that is a hormone called anti-mullerian hormone, or AMH. This is a hormone that it's probably the first thing that a human doctor will look at for a woman that is worried about her fertility. So I know that AMH levels are high when a female is fertile during her younger years, and they start dropping off pretty dramatically around the age of 35, which is when we see pregnancy rates also drop off. But we've never looked at that in bears or most wildlife species. So that was one of the first things. We had an intern who was really interested in looking at AMH in polar bears, and it followed very similar trends to what we see in humans. We see it really high shortly after birth, but that's probably just artifact. But it seems to peak around the ages of like 9 to about 18, then it drops off pretty quickly. So it seems like it's giving us some insight into when polar bears start losing their fertility, which is cool. We also, because we've been collecting blood from different bears from all across the country and storing them for years, we're starting to be able to piece together a lifetime of data for individual female bears. So this is a bear that lives up in the state of New York. She's moved around several times throughout her life, but I pieced together all these blood samples that were taken from different zoos. And when I put them together, we can see her fertility was highest around the age of 12 or 13, which is when we know in the wild they tend to give birth the most. And then it dropped off pretty quickly. And then she's about 24 now, but her chances of having cubs are pretty low. So this is good information to have when we're thinking about which bears to pair together for breeding, because maybe we shouldn't be wasting our efforts on these bears with a super, super low AMH, because we know that their ovarian reserves or their fertility is probably pretty low. Instead, let's focus on the females that have the high AMH, or maybe even older females that still have high AMH. That would give us some promise or hope that that female could conceive and have cubs. One other thing we're working on with the serum hormones is because these blood samples are so valuable, especially the samples collected from wild bears and the samples banked in veterinary hospitals across the country. Usually when we get a sample, a valuable sample, we have to prioritize what is the most important thing I want to measure from the sample. For this study, it was AMH. Sometimes it might be a thyroid hormone. But we're currently developing a method where instead of measuring one hormone in like 50 microliters of sample, we're measuring 12 different hormones in 50 microliters of sample. So this is going to be a game changer, hopefully by the end of the year when we have some of this data coming out. But we're starting to generate data from hormones that have never been measured before, and it doesn't require a lot of sample. So super cool for polar bears, but also for species where you can only get like a capillary tube full of blood, things like snakes or sparrows. You can't get mills and mills and mills of blood to do these analysis, but we're hoping this technique that we're pioneering in polar bears will then be applicable to other wildlife populations and species to sort of use the same model. So in addition to bears, we hope that the things that we learn from our zoo bears and our reproductive monitoring studies will be applicable to wild bears, but also to other species with similar reproductive patterns. So other seasonal breeders that have delayed implantation, that experience seemingly high rates of pseudopregnancy, things like red pandas and otters and sloth bears and pinnipeds. Hopefully we can take some of this knowledge and apply it to helping them and conserving them in their native habitat as well. So I'd like to thank the Lloyd Library and Museum and Patricia for inviting me here today. And of course, our funding sources, IMLS, the AZA Conservation Grants Fund, the Charlotte Schmidt-Lapp Fund, and Morris Animal Foundation. All of the zoos that have collected fecal samples for 10 plus years and sent those 35 samples to us for analysis. We couldn't do the work without them. And we're so fortunate that zoos aren't competitive in nature, but instead they're collaborative, because we couldn't do this work with 2 polar bears at Cincinnati Zoo. We really need larger numbers. And to do that, it's important to collaborate. So at that point, I'll take any questions and leave you with a cartoon. Question?
You talked about this delayed implantation phenomenon that occurs in polar bears. You said other mammals, I guess. Do you have any hypotheses from an evolutionary standpoint to explain why that would be preserved? It seems like it gives more time to threaten the fetus or the embryo.
Yeah, so the theory behind why delayed implantation or embryonic diapause evolved is so that it uncouples breeding with parturition dates, so that cubs are born at a time that they're more likely to survive. So for polar bears, the cubs are born in November and December, which immediately doesn't sound like a good time to survive, because that's when it's coldest up there. But by the time they're ready to come out of the dens in March, that's when the temperatures are heating up, and that's when it's a more favorable environment to them. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a neat, frustrating system, you know, because they have essentially 2 distinct phases of pregnancy, the diapause phase and the placental pregnancy phase. So even if we do come up with a pregnancy test, we'll likely need 2, 1 for each phase. Question in the back?
I'd say the list of zoos that you work with, what's work being done in Europe that comes to you or is useful to you?
Yes and no. It's there's so much red tape with transporting biological samples across, even from Canada to the US. We can receive fecal samples from Canada, but we can't receive blood samples or urine samples or polar bears. So there's a lot of red tape with working with such a high profile species that's listed as threatened under the US Endangered Species Act, and it's also protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So unfortunately, we don't do as much active collaboration as we'd like, but we do share ideas.
Is there any sense that you could perhaps, I don't know how the data would be collected, but there would be no limit on sharing data?
Correct.
Just samples.
Yeah, we can definitely share data. Yeah, there's the European zoos don't seem to be as like organized and collaborative, and I think a lot of it is a language barrier because they all speak different languages. So recently there was a meeting it's called the EAZA, the European Association of Zoos and Aquarium, and you know, they don't, like, we can pick up the phone and call Louisville Zoo or call Columbus Zoo. It's not as easy for them to pick up a German zoo to pick up the phone and call an Irish zoo, for example. There's a lot of barriers that we don't experience here in the US that they do have in Europe. But yes, we could share data in theory. Yes.
Question.
Huh? What was it?
He wants to know if polar bears can survive in Antarctica.
I bet they do great in Antarctica. And if we hated penguins, we could probably send some down there. But yeah, polar bears, it's a perfect environment for them. There's seals down there to hunt. But so I've been to both the Arctic and recently the Antarctic. And the biggest difference that I noticed, aside from lack of polar bears, is that in the Arctic, the species are scared. If you see a seal, it jumps into the water really quickly. It's used to being hunted. If you go to Antarctica, you can walk up to within a foot and touch a seal and doesn't go anywhere. Penguins too, you can walk right up to them. They don't have any land predators down there. So I think they would destroy it quickly. Yeah, so if they ate all the seals, they'd go for the penguins, they'd go for all the eggs. Interesting, Antarctica, the word Antarctica means no bear, without bear, Antarctic. Yeah. Thanks.
I guess I'm wondering, like, are you a process or a product person? Like, do you enjoy the different research iterations? Are you getting discouraged? And
That's a great question. I asked myself that. What keeps me motivated? I think the thing that keeps me motivated is that technology evolves so fast, and there's always something like new to try. So in the beginning, when we're just looking at the steroid hormones, I'm like, well, we've never looked at proteins. Now we can do all these like 2D differential in-gel electrophoresis and all these like super advanced protein analyses. So that was cool. And then that one went out. And like, there's always been something new to try. So that's been encouraging for me. Now we have the blood samples. So that's a whole new thing. Ask me again in 20 years what I think of that. But yeah, sometimes it's hard to stay motivated when I don't get a lot of wins. You know, most of the results that come out are negative data. We don't get a lot of births, you know. So yeah, it can be frustrating. Yeah. You got your hand up.
Yeah, you see all these tourist things to the edge of Hudson Bay, where they go and out and play with the polar bears, or they have polar bears roll over their vehicles or something. But they're on land at that time.
Yes.
What part of their life cycle is that?
So that is in usually October and November is the best time to see polar bears on land. And they are at that time, they're waiting for the Hudson Bay to freeze. So they all sort of congregate at this spot because they know this is where the ice forms the earliest. And as soon as that ice forms, then they can go out and start hunting again. So usually in October, November, there's just a lot of hungry polar bears waiting at the shore, waiting for that ice to freeze to go out. So yes, that's the best time and place to see polar bears because there's so many of them and you're pretty much guaranteed to see them.
They don't den up there, or they will go out and den on the ice?
Some of them will den on land, but most den on the ice. Yeah. But there are certainly populations that are more inclined to den on land, but yeah, they're happy to be in a icy snow den as well.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the actual collection of blood samples? What is the technology involved in that, and how did that?
Yeah. So I would say if you have like a dog at home, well, imagine trying to get a blood sample from your dog, but you can't touch your dog. So that's what we're working with. So these polar bears is completely protected contact. We never share space with them, but the keepers build great relationships with the animals that they work with. And a process like that takes many, many months. So usually they'll start by training small behaviors and approximate until they get the actual behavior that they want. So to be less wishy-washy on that answer. So with our polar bears at Cincinnati, the first thing that we had them do is they learned to come to the bars, essentially when called. So they would come over, get a treat for that. The next thing we taught our female to do was to lay down because we knew she needed to advance her paw into that blood draw training.
I remember seeing that. It's like a cage.
Yeah. So it'll take too long. So we wanted her to lay down. So if she started showing standing there for a little while and she seems to be getting a little lazy, maybe she'll sit first. She'll get rewarded for that. Anything that approximates that laying down behavior, she'd get rewarded for until finally she is laying down. And that's the behavior that we'd ask for. The next step is we wanted her to put her foot into the blood draw chute why would a polar bear do that naturally? So we sit there and wait, and then finally she would start to, we can either target train her, so have her trained to touch a target. So maybe she would learn to touch the target through that. Or sometimes we just wait for her to present the behavior, like move her toes a little bit, she get a treat. And then she learns, oh, they want me to move my toes. And the next time she moves her toes, she doesn't get a treat. So she puts her foot forward a little bit, then she gets a bigger treat. So it's approximating these behaviors until we get her to put her foot all the way in, hold it still. But then we need to get her used to having her foot touched, because most of these bears have never had their feet touched. So then you just sort of start with a touch, and that's good. You get a treat, you didn't pull away. But then we got to get used to the clippers. Clippers are loud, you know, they shake on the metal, they make loud sounds. It feels weird against your skin. After the clippers are trained, then we have to put on the betadine or the alcohol solution and wipe it down before you do the needle stick. And that's the one I love telling most about our female. So the betadine that we use is like orange in color. So the female, the first time, like she was so used to it at that point, we did the clipping, they did the touching and the poking and prodding. They did the betadine and she was fine. And she looked down and her foot was orange and she pulled it in real fast, wiped it off and put her foot back. So it's more of like the visual that was more disturbing. It didn't hurt her, obviously, but then she learned it was fine. And then they started poking her over time with like just a blunt needle, just to get her used to the sensation of a little needle poke. And finally, one day they just introduced the sharp needle and then get the blood sample. So it looks easy when you see that one photograph of sticking a butterfly needle into a polar bear paw, but you know, there's other things in there like finding the veins and all the other stuff that goes into it. So it's a process that does take a long time, but the training techniques have come so far in recent years, and we're able to train animals to do amazing things. So a lot of zoos right now are voluntarily training their bears for voluntary blood collection. So it's really cool. In addition to research, we can get information that we need to diagnose diseases and stuff too. So as part of their annual medical workups, maybe we just take a blood sample instead of immobilizing the bear every year. Yeah, I'm back.
Where is the idea of the approximate population of polar bears in the United States? What's the real population in North America? What's the real population of polar bears in the zoos? I don't have an idea.
Yeah, so I don't know. Do you mean, so in just the Alaska and Canadian population, I don't know the breakdown of those numbers. They estimate that most of the polar bears live in Russia. So if we say there's like 20 to 25,000 polar bears throughout this entire circumpolar Arctic, maybe 5,000 to 8,000 of those are across the Canadian and Alaska coast. In zoos in the United States right now, we have about 55 polar bears, so not a lot. Canada probably has about 30. So in North America, we have about 80 bears in the US, in North America. Yeah. Beth, or sorry.
Is there more known about the relationship between temperature and their sense of smell? Because I know for humans, like we're more sensitive closer to our body temperature.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know of too many olfactory studies going on with polar bears right now. A big area of focus right now is their hearing, because we want to know how oil mining and oil rigs will impact denning females. So there have been more recent studies looking at hearing. The only scent study that I'm aware of is the one that took the biopsies of the feet and looked at the different glands that secrete different pheromones that they think polar bears use for communication. But I don't know as far as smelling, like what their range is or that, but that would be something interesting to look at for sure. Yes.
So where are we on the extinction issue? My understanding is global warming is proceeding 3 times faster in the Arctic than other parts of the world.
Yeah, I don't have those exact numbers. Polar bears, there are 20,000 of them, so they're certainly not doing great compared to other species that there are tons of. Humans, for example, 7 billion. So it's a stark contrast. But we know that polar bears, they need seals, so they need sea ice to hunt seals. So with the threat of sea ice receding and not forming as large extent year to year as it did in the past, that's a huge threat to the future of polar bears. As far as predictions on models of when they might go extinct, you hear different things across the board. They'll be extinct in 50 years or 200 years. I don't know if there's a firm consensus on that.
Is poaching a problem?
Not so much. I mean, there is some of the indigenous populations have allowed tag numbers, I guess that's the right term. They're allowed to hunt a certain amount of bears per year. I'm sure some poaching happens, but I mean, it's hard to get to polar bears. So you're not just out like shooting a polar bear in the backyard. You really have to put in effort to get there. So probably not as high as some other endangered species. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
is there any work done or thought about actually having polar bears that are born in a zoo taken
Yes,
back to the wild?
that's a good question. And it's worked in some other species like black-footed ferrets, California condor is another good example. But polar bears need to learn so many life skills from their mom those first 2 to 3 years. So they need to learn how to wait patiently by a seal hole, how to ambush prey, how to dig out dens. And these are things that we just can't teach them in zoos. So they've tried doing a few isolated cases of adoptions. So finding an orphan cub on sea ice, and they would take like another mom with cubs and like take the urine from her and sort of rub it on that cub. So maybe they could trick her into thinking it's hers, and it hasn't worked. So they're smart. So I think breeding bears in zoos and reintroducing them from the wild is a long shot. Yeah.
How much, sorry, how much time do you actually get to spend with bear? I mean, it sounds like you spend most of your time with bear poop.
Yeah, very little. Yeah. Yeah.
How much time do you actually get to spend with?
Yeah. So right now we don't have polar bears at the Cincinnati Zoo, but when we did, I went down regularly for our training sessions, ultrasound training, did a lot of ultrasounds on our females. I go to probably 4 procedures per year at other zoos. So anytime a zoo is immobilizing their bear for an annual physical or a pre-shipment exam, I'll usually go out and do a reproductive health exam on the bear at the time. So I probably spend 2 hours with bears a year, not much. Yeah, so we do the semen collections, pretty non-invasive and quick, and yeah, not much.
Well, Erin, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. Our programs are supported in part by the members of the Lloyd Library. If you would like to contribute to programs like these, visit our website at lloydlibrary.org. We hope to see you next time.